On March 5, 1999, 16-year-old Faye went missing from a posh neighborhood in Palo Alto, California, after a night of babysitting for the Van Alden family. 1 month later, she reappeared, narrating a nightmarish ordeal to the authorities. Her story was disturbing and hard to believe, but when the authorities investigated, they uncovered shocking new details that made Faye's account seem chillingly real. The following is the account Faye narrated to the authorities.
Living with an alcoholic single mother forced me to take up jobs at an early age. I relied on the earnings from babysitting the neighborhood kids. Though I didn't earn much, I had to make it work with whatever I got. But things changed when I got an offer from the Van Alden family to babysit their 8-year-old daughter, Soraya. Mrs. Midcliffe, a regular client, had recommended me to Mrs. Alden. Mrs. Midcliffe gave me the address, and around 5 p.m., I found myself standing in front of the largest mansion in the neighborhood. The houses were enormous, each one more fancier than the last, but the Van Alden mansion was the grandest of them all. I rang the bell, and Mrs. Van Alden met me at the door. She was nothing as I had expected. She looked skinny with dark circles like she hadn't slept in ages. She welcomed me in, showed me the pantry, and asked me to prepare something to eat. Mr. Van Alden soon arrived and looked even worse, with pale skin making him look like a vampire. They looked like they were in a hurry, and just before leaving, Mrs. Van Alden handed me a note and asked me to read it once they were gone. She also gave me a thick envelope of cash and a cell phone, saying, "Call me or Mr. Alden if there is any trouble. Our numbers are saved on this phone." Before I could even reply, they left in their fancy car. Soraya was a healthy girl who wore an emerald dress that matched her stunning green eyes. She was the sweetest kid that I had ever met. We played together, and I forgot about the note until it was time to prepare dinner. The chicken roast took an hour to cook, and Soraya and I had dinner at 7:30. After dinner, I finally read the note. The note stated, "Dear Faye, thank you for accepting our offer. We can't express how grateful we are to get a day away from our routine. There are some things that you must adhere to no matter what. 1. You must give Soraya her medicine, which is marked, and in a glass kept in the refrigerator. 2. Put Soraya to bed by 8 p.m., no later. 3. Lock her room after you leave, and do not open the door no matter what, even if she screams. 4. If someone calls on the telephone, do not answer. We will contact you on the cell phone provided. 5. Stay on the first floor, and only in case of an emergency you may lock yourself in the bathroom on the first floor. 6. If you see an old man in the living room watching television, ignore him. He will try to talk to you and engage you in a conversation but do not reply. He's more or less harmless. 7. You will hear people whispering. Ignore them. 8. If you see a wooden door with a metal rim, do not enter. 9. If you see cats, leave them alone. They're harmless. However, if you mess up any of the rules, just follow the cats. They will escort you to safety. 10. If you suddenly find yourself in a room with taxidermy mounts, keep walking for 7 minutes and you should be back in the house. 11. Do not roam around the house after 1:15 a.m. I was quite spooked by this bizarre list. I looked at the time, and it was already 7:50 p.m. Rule number 1. I needed to give Soraya her medicine. I took the jar out of the fridge and was suddenly put off by the pungent smell. It had a strong metallic smell and a very thick consistency, almost like blood, but it couldn't have been blood. I brushed the thought away and gave Soraya a glass of the liquid. She quickly drank it and licked her lips as if she had the most delectable concoction. Rule number 2 stated I needed to put Soraya to bed before 8 p.m., so I took her to her bedroom, which looked pretty normal to me except for the 2 padlocks on her door and scratches on the wooden furniture. Since the list mentioned cats, I figured it must be their doing. I put Soraya to bed, and as I was leaving, she said, "Don't forget to lock the door." I felt bad for the girl, but who was I to question? So I locked her door and came down to the kitchen to clean the dishes. It must have been 8:25 p.m. when I heard a scream from upstairs. My first instinct was to check if Soraya was fine, but then she called my name and laughed. I waited a minute, when suddenly she screamed again, now in rage. "Open the door, Faye, or I will kill you." About an hour later, the screams had become more consistent, with moments of quiet in between. I started hearing whispers from every corner, like a posh party where people stood in groups murmuring, but nobody was around. It must have been 10:40 p.m. when the phone rang, startling me. I did exactly as the note instructed. I let it ring. I decided to watch TV in the guest room. When I went to the kitchen to get some water, I heard a man's laughter in the living room. I saw an old, haggard man sitting on the couch watching TV and laughing. The TV was playing a late-night show from the 60s. I didn't know they still aired those shows. And the TV itself looked very old. The man was unkempt and wore overalls that had ancient stains that even bleach couldn't remove. The room had an awful stench, and I could see flies swarming around the man, yet he sat there unbothered and laughing. I must have been standing there for too long because he turned, stared at me dead in the eye, and let out a scoff before resuming watching his show. "Are you the new help?" he said without looking at me. I followed the rule and didn't answer. He spoke again and mentioned a Mrs. Olwen, the previous owner of the house. He said she was an intelligent woman who saw through the deception, and he wished he had asked her to marry him. I quickly went into the kitchen without replying, and as I walked back, I froze in my spot. I had stepped into an unfamiliar room. A chill ran down my spine when I saw taxidermy mounts of various large animals. I was in a room I shouldn't be. For a few seconds, I couldn't remember what I was supposed to do. My instincts told me to run. I remembered I had 7 minutes to get out of the room. As I ran through the hallways, every step felt heavy, and the animals looked like they were turning to look at me. The fear made me run faster. I finally got out of the room and felt relief. I had a strange feeling it took me less than 7 minutes. I stepped forward to go to the guest room when I heard the old man now laughing hysterically. I turned to see that he was not looking at his TV but at me. "What did you bring with you?" he said. All the hair on my body rose as I turned around. There stood a man staring at me. But the man had the head of a goat. He was tugging on my shirt. He towered over me, standing almost 7 feet tall. My mouth was wide open, but I had lost my voice. He said something in a strange language that I couldn't understand. As I stepped back, I could now see the interlaced veins where the goat's head was attached to the man's body. What did I do wrong? I then remembered the list said walk, but I ran. The goat man then opened its mouth and let out a scream that sounded like no animal I had ever heard. I ran again and entered the first door that I saw and shut it behind me. The goat man stopped screaming and there was silence. But as I stepped away from the door, I saw that it was a wooden door with a metal rim. I messed up again. I was not supposed to be there. I had no choice but to climb down the stairs. As soon as I reached the floor, I was enveloped by a thick fog. With zero visibility, I tried making my way through. I hit my knee on something hard and fell. It was a headstone. The fog had started to clear, and slowly I saw more headstones. I was in a graveyard, and it freaked me out. I wanted to call Mrs. Van Alden, but I had dropped the cell phone somewhere. The man with the goat's head screamed again and appeared in the fog. I didn't know what to do or in which direction to run. As I looked around, I saw a black cat run behind the gravestones. I quickly ran and followed the cat. I don't remember how long I had been running before I saw a gate. The cat ran out of the gate, and so did I. As I did, I found myself in the mansion's backyard. I looked up and saw Soraya staring at me from her bedroom window. Her hands were pressed against the glass, and her fingers were abnormally long, like they had claws. I took off and ran back home as fast as I could. Everything on my way back looked kind of quiet and foggy. When I reached home, it was empty, which didn't surprise me. I was used to my mother being out drinking all night. But that night, I felt scared. I decided to stay in my room and wait for my mother to get back home. But things took a turn for the worse when the telephone rang. When I picked it up, all I could hear was static before a voice spoke, a demonic voice that I immediately recognized. It was the man with the goat's head, but this time I could understand him. "You can't run. You can't hide. I will always be there by your side." I slammed the phone and almost broke it. But then it rang again. Something was different in the air. It felt different. It felt normal. The phone was still ringing. I finally picked it up, and it was the hospital calling to tell me that my mom had a car accident. She had fractured her arm and had cuts and bruises, but nothing life-threatening. They urged me to come to the hospital immediately. My heart jumped out of my chest when I saw the man with the goat's head pressing his palm against the window as he stood outside. I couldn't risk my mother's life, so I grabbed some clothes and money and ran from my house. I boarded a bus to wherever it took me. I had traveled all night, and the next morning I was in a new city I did not recognize. I tried asking people where I was, but they ignored me. I didn't know where to go, so I sat in a park for a long time planning what to do next, when I heard someone say, "He'll find you here." I turned and saw an older woman sitting next to me. I was surprised because I didn't notice her coming and sitting next to me. She introduced herself as Martha Olwen, and I remembered the old man talking about Mrs. Olwen. I knew it was unlikely, but I took my shot and asked if she was the previous owner of the mansion in Palo Alto. She smiled and nodded. She also knew I was being chased by that ungodly entity and said that I had been marked, and unless I changed my identity and cut ties with my loved ones, the devil's embodiment would continue posing a threat to my family and me. She told me I needed divine protection, so I took refuge in the church where she served. While living there, I volunteered with cleaning duties and barely spoke to anyone but Mrs. Olwen. I've been there for a month, and I haven't seen the entity since. Yesterday, Mrs. Olwen packed my bag and put me on a bus saying, "It's time to go back home." I asked why, but she wouldn't answer. So here I am hoping you would believe me that there is something very wrong with the Alden family.
After hearing Faye's unbelievable story, the police returned to the Alden mansion to question the family again. The Aldens stuck to their story about Faye and evaded further questioning, using their wealth and influence to avoid cooperation. Without a warrant, the police went back to Faye's mother's house and found a funeral in progress. They were shocked to learn that it was Faye's funeral. When they informed Faye's mother that Faye had recently reported a case at the police station, she was stunned. She revealed that Faye had been in a coma since babysitting at the Alden house a month ago and had just died in her sleep the previous day. The Aldens had been paying for her care and had insisted on keeping the situation quiet. The police returned to the Alden mansion, only to find the family had disappeared, taking their daughter with them. In the basement, they discovered evidence of devil worship, strange demonic markings, animal bones, and books. They also found family pictures of the Alden family in which their daughter Soraya was not anything like Faye had described. Soraya looked like a weak and crippled girl, bound to a wheelchair. Additionally, the officers found a hidden compartment containing detailed records and photographs implicating many other wealthy neighbors in a secretive cult. The photos showed disturbing rituals, gatherings, and evidence of sacrificial ceremonies. Headlines screamed about the affluent Palo Alto neighborhood harboring a sinister secret, and the case dominated news cycles for weeks. The authorities launched a manhunt for the Aldens, but they vanished without a trace. Despite the extensive media coverage and the subsequent investigation, many questions remained unanswered. The story of Faye and the Van Alden family haunts Palo Alto, and to this day, the Aldens have never been found. For the authorities, the biggest question that remains unsolved was, if Faye was in a coma under her mother's care, who was the girl who looked exactly like Faye and reported the Aldens? For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.